A trembling hand let 2 coins tumble onto a counter of petals and dust. The metal a tiny bell in the hush of the flower stall. The stall smelled of sun-warmed jasmine and the dry whiff of the street beyond. The coin slid between chamomile and a sprig of rosemary and came to rest by a tin of rusted pins. Elias Rowen kept his hat low and his face turned from the shopkeeper, though his eyes drank in the colors like a man noticing something for the first time. "Take your pick," the woman behind the counter said, soft, careful. Her hair was the color of hay in fall, her hands stained faintly with soil. "They'll do you good." He did not answer right away. He watched a bee make a slow, deliberate landing on a pale yellow rose and felt the smallness of the creature's world, its errands. When he finally spoke, the words were small too. "Do they stay pretty long?" "They'll last as long as someone tends them," she said. The tending speech should have meant nothing to him then, but it lodged in him like a splinter. A week before, in a dim office, Dr. Everett Lang had said the only thing that could not be coaxed away. "A month, maybe less," the doctor had told him with a gravity that folded the room in on itself. The phrase had no place in Elias's life. His days had been measured by sunrise and rope, by daylight wages and the feel of leather. Time as a precise thing, counted in weeks, was a sharp new geometry. He walked out of the clinic with the axis of his life altered, and, like a man with a map that no longer fit his hands, drifted toward places he had avoided. The little flower shop belonged to May Delaney. Locals called it the Delaney Bloom, but the bell over the door announced itself in a soft reedy ring that seemed apologetic for interrupting. May's mother, Hazel, had tended the town's bouquets for years before the garden fell quiet under her hands. People still spoke of Hazel as though petals might be a kind of prayer. Her name lived in the soil of the Madeline Street parcel, where lavender and bright, stubborn marigolds pushed at the edge of the walk. May ran the shop with a gentle steadiness. She had the sort of face that held attention without demanding it, and when Elias first entered, she greeted him like someone who had room on her shelf for another sorrow. "You're in need of something?" she asked, taking his coins without looking at them, as if she had accepted more than the medals at the counter. "Maybe," he said. He chose a small bunch of yellow roses, not because he believed in their language, but because they were the color of light through hay. That evening, he walked out of town, roses wrapped in brown paper, and felt the world tilt in a way he did not yet have words for. In Dry Creek, people took notice of who arrived and why. Sheriff Tomlin Creed tipped his hat, as if to a familiar stranger, when Elias passed the courthouse with the roses. The sheriff had the slow, easy observation of someone who saw months and years run into one another and knew the value of keeping an eye open for small kindnesses. "You look like you could use the shade," the sheriff said once, nodding toward the bench under the post office awning. Elias only nodded back. He did not deny the weary angle of his shoulders. The town watched, and slowly, like water wearing its stone, the watching turned to small commitments. Elias found reasons to return to May's shop. A stem to set on a windowsill, a question about which bulb sprouted first in spring, a piece of bread when he'd been riding farther than planned. May welcomed him without ceremony. Tea on cold mornings, a towel after a rain, the quiet of someone who did not ask for proof before offering care. Those visits formed a kind of montage in the town's memory. Him standing awkwardly while she wrapped stems, her laughing once at a clumsy attempt he made to tuck a rose into his saddle, a sheriff standing off to the side with a soft wry smile as if he knew a secret that would only be true if no one spoke it. Flowers became a recurring image. Yellow roses on his hatband, a sprig tucked into his shirt when he slept at the stable, petals floating on the surface of his cup of coffee like little suns. They were simple, common things, but they piled up into a life softening at the edges. One afternoon, when the light slanted the way it does before a storm, Elias stopped in the doorway and said something he had not planned. "I'd like to go by my mother's grave." May turned, hands in the soil of a potted plant she was repotting. She blinked, the motion small, then straightened. "Where is it?" "Out past the canyon, lone oak on the ridge, wooden cross. She liked wildflowers." His sentence was a list of landmarks, not memories. But his voice caught on the last word, as if he surprised himself by naming what he wanted. May didn't ask him why now. She merely folded a small bouquet and tucked it under her arm. "We can ride tomorrow," she said. Elias felt something like a relief, the steadying of a ship settling into a harbor. The thing he had not known how to ask for had been given. He had always been a man of small keeps. Knots carved in wood with a pocket knife, a name etched into the back of a saddle, but asking another person to hold space for him was new and required a different courage. He nodded, and the nod had the weight of an agreement between two people who had not yet learned to name what they were saving. If this story is finding you somewhere near your own questions, and you'd like to see more like it, please like and subscribe. There are more tales of small grace to share. The next morning they set out before the town had fully rubbed the sleep from its eyes. May rode with a steadiness that matched the careful way she handled flowers. She had grown up riding the fences around Hazel Delaney's plot and knew the pulse of a horse under her. Elias was quieter on the saddle, the set of a man who had spent decades in the sun. The plains unfolded in long amber waves. Dust rose in a soft cloud and settled behind them like a memory. There were stretches of land where the wind seemed to speak and then fall silent out of respect. They rode without insisting on conversation. At first, the words between them were practical: where to cross the arroyo, whether to water the horses at a spring they passed. Then, as the afternoon slid toward blue dusk, the quiet around the fire let loose a few more secrets, not so much confessions as unlatched gates. May asked about the carved horses that Elias kept tied to his saddle, little wooden figurines he'd made out of a scrap of pine. He told her, in a voice that gave away nothing and everything, that his mother used to tell him stories about horses who knew the way back when people forgot their roots. He had tried, he said, to keep a few of those stories alive in the wood. They made camp by a river, a low place where the water moved slow enough to reflect the night. May built the fire as if she had been taught hands-on by Hazel herself. The careful arrangement of kindling, the tendering of flame, the crackle and the scent of burning cedar sat between them. Elias took his boots off and watched the flames lift shadows across his face. He was moved by small, simple things now. May's siphon of light where the lamplight met her hair. The way the horse's soft munching came like punctuation to the night. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said at one point, not as a rebuke, but as a gift. "Just the bits that matter." He considered, then sighed. "I said I'd seen a lot of things," he admitted. "But there's a part I kept to myself. I figured I'd keep it that way, felt safer." "You can let it out," she said. "I'll hold it." He let it out in pieces, the image of his mother standing in a doorway while the sun made her outline thin, the way she'd sing under her breath when she potted a new sprig, the shape of her hands. He spoke of the days he had missed her most and of the things left unsaid, the gratitude, the apologies, the small love that had rested like an unnamed coin in his pocket. May asked only once if he had anyone else to speak to, and when he said no, she did not press with pity. She simply listened in a way that turned his telling into a thing made real, rather than a confession to air. When the conversation ran out, they sat with the small, steady noise of the river and the horses in their soft chewing. Elias reached into his saddlebag and produced the carved pair of horses. They were simple, the work of a careful hand, the grain of the wood worn smooth by fingers. "Kept them for when I thought I might stand again," he said. "Kept them as proof there was something like a home." "Keep one," May said suddenly. "For the shop, for Hazel." He looked at her. For a heartbeat he saw himself as he might have been at 15, raw and proud, and not yet sure how to ask for what he wanted. He nodded, slow. "All right." The ride toward the canyon the next day had the hush of people approaching a holy place. The ridge with the lone oak stood like an answer, its branches splayed like arms. The grave was modest, an unadorned mound with a weathered wooden cross, letters blurred by rain and sun. Around it, stubborn wildflowers clustered as if they, too, remembered the woman's touch. Elias dismounted with a care that suggested the practice of a man who respected limits. He placed the yellow roses on the mound with hands that trembled not from dread, but from the force of the moment. He talked to the earth as if it were a person. His voice was low and damaged in places. It had the honesty of a man who had measured silence with years and found it wanting. At first his words were practical. He spoke of the weather, of the horses, of small incidents only the living had kept. But then the sentences grew into something like a confession, and the air around the grave seemed to hold them like a lantern. May stood a few paces away, the bouquet in her hands like a prayer folded into paper. She watched him with a tenderness that did not try to steer him into anything. When he faltered, she stepped closer and lowered her voice to the kind of soft insistence that asks for truth without demanding it. "Say it," she whispered. "Say the thing you couldn't before." He blinked. There was a long, private breath. The words came slow and deliberate, as if he had been practicing them in the dark. "Ma," he began. "Her name an island in the sea. The rest of the sentence left him like cattle through a gate. He caught it roughly. Then easier, inevitable, he added, "I love you." The syllables dropped into the dry earth like seeds. The effect on Elias was immediate and visible. A pressure he had carried for years uncoiled from his shoulders. May exhaled, quietly, and the landscape around them seemed to acknowledge the closure. It was not salvation that rearranged the world. No miracle set himself back on a path of long life, but something quieter. A letting go, a sealing of the ledger. The grave, the oak, the wind through the branches, these were witnesses. They stayed there for a while, arranging the flowers, smoothing the soil with the back of a hand. Elias touched the wooden cross as if it might absorb the words he had spoken and magnify their truth. He told May a story about his mother's laugh that made her smile despite herself. "She used to hide the best seeds at the back of the cupboard for spring," he said it teaches patience. On the ride home, the sunset was a long, generous thing. The plain took on a burnished color, as if the earth too were showing its best face for the journey's return. Elias seemed to ride a bit taller, not because his body had changed, but because some interior measure had found rest. In town, Sheriff Creed tipped his hat and, without a word, seemed to endorse what had happened. Small gestures carrying understanding heavy as a ledger. Those days that followed had the charm of ordinary miracles. Not miracles of cure, but of ordinary companionship. Bread shared at a table, medicine administered by Dr. Lang with a professional tenderness, visits from neighbors that were more presents than prying. People spoke of Elias's improved appetite and of the way his laugh came back in short, thrumming bursts. He carved another horse one afternoon in the shade behind the stable, whittling with a steady focus that made the sheriff chuckle when he saw it. "A trade for his immortality," the sheriff said, mostly kidding. Elias only smiled in a way that counted as both answer and denial. But the diagnosis was not a rumor that unraveled. It was a fact that kept its shape. The decline was not sudden like a storm, but slow and deliberate as winter's first frost. Weeks folded into each other, and the weather of Elias's body changed. There were mornings when he could not mount the horse without help, when the breath in his chest felt like a thing borrowed for only a few hours at a time. Still, his spirits remained mostly intact. He took to walking the shop's garden with May in the late afternoons, while she tended to the soil, and told him about simple things. A new bulb arriving, a bird that had nested in the rafters. They spoke in small sentences and in silences that both of them knew how to hold. Dr. Everett Lang visited with a bag that held the implements of his trade and a face that measured professional hope against inevitable truth. He did not look away when he said what needed saying, and his manner was so plain that pain had no room to dress itself in melodrama. "It's coming," he told Elias candidly in one visit, speaking like a man who does not soften facts with unreachable promises. Not like a thief in the night, but as the river makes its way. Elias nodded as if he had been preparing for this phrasing all along. The town's preacher called a few times, offering the kind of prayers that were not doctrine but company. May would stand at the edge of the room during those calls, her hands finding his and holding them like anchors. The final week gathered itself like a shadow. The days were thin. Elias's breathing had the rhythm of someone reading the last lines of a book already beloved. He spent more time lying beneath the small window of the room he took at the boarding house near May's shop, watching dust motes drift through the light. May kept the flowers from Hazel's garden near his bed. Their scent was a soft insistence that life continued, even if in a smaller grade. She read to him sometimes, farm accounts, town notices, sometimes nonsense lines from books she loved. Her voice was like someone weaving a rug of words to cover a space too chill for waking things. On the last evening, the room outside had a low, forgiving light. The sheriff came to check in, sat a respectful distance away, and watered the plants that needed it. Dr. Lang had done what he could for pain, and the medication kept the sharp edges dulled. Elias's hand, when May took it, felt like a piece of warmed wood. There was no great goodbye, because they had been practicing the finality together for weeks, making the shape of it small and manageable. Instead, there were small acts, arranging a lock of hair by the bedside, smoothing a blanket, tucking the carved horse, now worn with new marks, into May's palm. When the breath grew shallow and time seemed to taste of salt and cedar, Elias turned his head so his eyes found May's. He mouthed something that might have been a joke, then a name. She leaned in close and pressed her forehead to his, the gesture private and entire. "You did what you needed to do," she said, and it was not an assessment but a true summation. He had, in the time he had, gone to the place he wanted, spoken what mattered, and carried it gently home. He made a small sound that could have been a laugh or a yes, then last, reached and found the carved horse tucked into her hand. He closed his eyes as if the motion itself were a seal. He died with her fingers in his, the room held in a hush broken only by the gentle creak of the chair and the far-off bark of a dog in the street. It was quiet in the way that follows rain, clean, full of space for what had been. There was sorrow, of course, but also an odd, steady sense of completion. Elias's passing did not solve life's puzzles. It simply closed one story in a way that made sense to the people who loved him. The funeral took place under the oak on the ridge, the tree that had witnessed his confession. The preacher stood and spoke in a tone that was human rather than grand, mentioning the smallness of acts that knit people together. Bread shared, a horse tended, silence kept, and then broken in the right ways. Sheriff Tomlin Creed stood close, bearing the kind of look that reads like history, the living ledger of a town. Dr. P.U. Lang gave a brief nod to the mourners and then allowed the town to take over with their grief and memory. May's eulogy was short and exact. She did not try to make Elias into a saint, nor reduce him to a story. She spoke of arrival and leaving with the dignity of someone naming what had been seen plainly. "Elias came to our doors like a storm at first," she said, and the image fit. He had been a man who carried a certain weather of his own. And he left us a lesson in how to live. He showed up when it mattered. He learned to let someone else hold his days. He taught us to speak the small things we leave unsaid. Her voice never rose to grand oration. It settled like a hand on a shoulder. People wept, some openly, some quietly, each in the way they had loved him. After the burial, when the mourners dispersed and the town breathed again in its ordinary rhythms, May returned to her shop. The Delaney Bloom reopened with the slow daily rituals of tending and trimming. The shop smelled of soil and lemon oil, and something quietly brave. May placed one of Elias's carved horses on the shelf by the window, where passers-by would see it catch the light. It sat beside a small cluster of yellow roses that had the same soft, steady color as the ones Elias had chosen on his first day in town. People came in to see the horse, to leave a memory, to buy stems for a grave or for the table. The sheriff stopped by and left a mullein stalk tucked into the bouquet he bought. Dr. Lang came with a packet of seeds Hazel had once loved. On slow afternoons, May would lift the carved horse up to the light and feel the worn grooves where Elias's hands had held it. She would tell the story, not in loud words, but in the way she arranged the bouquets. More lavender near the back to suggest hiding seeds in cupboards, a touch of rosemary for remembrance. There were nights when she stood in the doorway after the shop closed, the bell hanging silent, and listened to the wind run its fingers over the street. It sounded, she thought, like someone riding off in the distance, the memory of a horse's gait catching the horizon. She kept his carved horse on a small ledge where dust could settle around it and bees might confuse the scent of wax with flower. When spring came and flowers pushed like questions through the hard dirt, May planted the seeds Hazel had tucked away and watched the shoots put up their small stubborn heads. The town remembered Elias Rowen in ways that honored the smallness he preferred. A patch of wildflowers left uncut by the road, a bench by the stable with a name carved into its back, and the stories people told about the man who had asked one simple thing at the end of all things, a ride to his mother's grave and the presence of someone who would listen. People would stop and tell the story of the carved horses in May's shop, how a quiet man had walked into a flower stand and let himself be tended. Life in Dry Creek continued. The bell over the Delaney Bloom's door chimed for new customers and old. The oak on the ridge watched new weather and old seasons. May kept the carved horse, worn and smoothed by use, in the window where it could catch whatever light passed through. Sometimes a traveler would pause and, seeing the horse and the flowers, would ask the price of a bouquet. May would smile as she always did and wrap the stems carefully, adding without fuss a little sprig of rosemary. She would hand the arrangement to the visitor and, by habit and memory, place the little carved horse beside the paper, as though it were a small benediction. On quiet evenings, when the town's noises had shrunk to a few steady ones, the click of a lamp, the snore of a dog, the occasional sound of hooves in the distance, May would think of Elias and of the way the last weeks had been made whole by the smallest of acts. She kept the memory of his hand in hers, the warmth of the carved horse, and the way the wind sounded as if it carried a man's unspoken thanks across the plain. The final request had been simple: one ride, one graveside, one confession. It had marked the end not as an erasure but as a fitting close, a last arc that made the story a whole thing, known and loved. If this tale touched you, share in the comments. What would your last request be? And if you'd like more stories of quiet courage and small mercies, consider subscribing. There are more waiting on the road.